I'm George Curtis. Welcome to It's Your Law. Each week it's my privilege to bring you guests that help all of us understand a little bit more about our law. Sometimes we're taught some things we wish we weren't taught, but those are probably the most important lessons. Sometimes we're talking to judges, attorneys, people who've been sued, people who are in the criminal process. And of course, right now, in case you've been out of the country, we are going through the tail end, I hope, of two of the most vociferous years in politics, especially in the legislature, that I have ever seen or even read about, ever taking place previously in the state of Wisconsin. I think totally unprecedented. And if you've been around here, you might be a little sick of it. And I don't want to make you sicker, but this is important. We're having an election on the 6th of November, and it's very, very important. It is going to determine the course of history for the next 2 years in the state of Wisconsin, and perhaps beyond that period of time. And today you're going to hear from one of the candidates who's already serving in the legislature, and I'd love to hear his point of view. Gordon Hintz, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, George.
Now, you have been in the state of Wisconsin legislature now for, what is it, 2007?
Yep, this is my 6th year, so 3rd term.
Were you ready for what happened in the last?
I don't think anybody could have been quite ready, and that includes the public. I've had 3 very different terms, one in the minority, but in a different era where there was divided government, one in the depths of the recession in the majority, and then the last 2 years. And they've all been very different, but you know, we do have difficult challenges, but I don't think anybody was ready for sort of the ideological, drive that this governor unleashed, not just in the legislature, but in the state. It's not like anything we'd ever seen before, and I think it's changed politics in the short term, not for the better, but I'm hopeful that, everybody can take a deep breath. We can all look at how we can try to focus on the challenging issues, but we're going to have to see.
Well, it's the most partisan, vindictive, vicious, petty period of time that I have seen in the state of Wisconsin. And from what I've read, it may be the most of all of those things in the history of the state of Wisconsin. But you were there. I read about it. I was in Oshkosh. Tell us what you saw.
Well, I mean, again, you're going to have differences in opinion. When Governor Walker came in and I met with him, my goal was to work together when you can, disagree when you have to. A lot of the issues that were brought forward, whether it was the budget repair bill or the voter ID or redistricting, it wasn't always the issue, but how it was handled. The bill, the controversial Act 10 bill. We first heard about it on the radio when interest groups put it out there, and then we were told it was going to be passed in 7 days and there wasn't going to be any public input. And then, this came as the governor was on record during the campaign saying he would sit down and negotiate. So to have your first action be something that has nothing to do with immediately, balancing the budget, that, makes your campaign statements completely false and turns the state on its head by repealing 50 years of law, was a tough start to things. I think everybody recognized that there was going to have to be concessions made. Everybody knew that we had tough budgets ahead of us. But this seemed more like it had an agenda that wasn't aimed at those, dollars. It was aimed at, enacting a price and demonstrating to everybody that, I'm the new guy in town and this is the way things are going to be.
Well, the governor had the votes. And the governor had the votes to ram anything through, and much of which has already been decided to be unconstitutional, and a lot more is going to be found unconstitutional. His measuring stick seemed to be reward his friends and punish his enemies and ram it through to show that he was in charge. And that really is something that was unprecedented in this state, where we have a pretty good history of people crossing the aisle and negotiating things and working out concessions. And it was shocking, and I want to tell you, you Democrats weren't ready for that.
Well, we had lost a number of seats. Usually when people campaign and say, I'm going to sit down and, bargain tough like I did when I was Milwaukee County Executive, we take them at their word. This is the first, and I think that's why you saw the actions, that followed. So we got off to a bad start, but time after time, when you think about the fact that, every member of the legislature that's a Republican signed a secrecy oath on the redistricting process, the voter ID bill, despite being warned several times, is caught up in several different court cases and is not into law. The legislature gave away responsibility to the executive branch. As the legislature, we took power away from Governor Doyle when we were there, getting rid of the Frankenstein veto and doing a number of things because we thought it was important, that the legislature as a body have power. These guys just blindly said, you go ahead, Governor Walker, and do things your way. And that made it tough. Anytime there's a bad economy, politics suffer. Your view of the world is shaped by how you're doing. And of course, this sort of divided people by feeding into their negativity. And, we've had 2 years to litigate, everything that's gone on, unprecedented recall elections, that's left people kind of spent. And now we've got the presidential campaigns. But the reality is we've got a lot of challenges ahead of us. There are new opportunities. I'm not saying that, it has to go better. I think it's incumbent on all of us, not just, the Republicans, but there's a lot of things that I would have done differently if I could have. But, we need to get back to at least trying to resolve problems in a, civil way and try to get back to good public policy, not just sort of an ideological agenda that's not based in reality.
Well, one thing that hit me, and I have voted for just as many Republicans as Democrats in the period of time I've been here. I ran for public office as a Republican almost 50 years ago, and I was one of Tommy Thompson's supporters back when he was governor. He was a great compromiser, and I voted for George Bush Sr. And Mike Ellis is probably one of my favorite senators. He's always been so wise and so intelligent about this. But what troubled me about this blitzkrieg, this bulldozer of going through all of this legislation that I hope we have a minute to discuss, is that every Republican didn't exercise any independent judgment, even though they had to know that much of this was just punishment. They had to know that much of it is going to be found to be unconstitutional. They had to know that this was bad government. But until one man stood up in the mining bill and had the guts to vote no to protect the environment, they all went along with it. And what that leads to is, first of all, our first break. And second, when we come back, it kind of tells us, and I want your discussion on this, how important it is to elect legislators that are going to vote their independent conscience. That's my first question when we get back. We'll be right back. Welcome back to It's Your Law. I'm George Curtis, and Representative Hintz and I are talking a little bit about the tumultuous experience of the last couple of years of Wisconsin politics. And we know, I know, and I'm sure you know, that there are Republican legislators who have courage, who have judgment, and know that this is a democratic process, yet where were they when all these things were being rammed through?
And that was, even the weekend that we were in break after it had been introduced, I called a number of my colleagues on the other side to try to say, hey, this is really a mess, can't we kind of, find a way out? Is there a compromise? But like you said earlier, they had the votes, and I don't think this was ever about policy. It was about politics. It was about settling scores. It was about crushing unions. It was about being an ideological hero of the conservative movement. It wasn't about good public policy. I thought guys like Mike Ellis and his quotes later on said, I told the governor, I warned him. But what we really needed was some people with some courage to stand up. Dale Schultz probably is one of the most popular people in Wisconsin now because of when he stood up on the mining bill. But threatening people with primaries and asking for ideological purity on everything is asking people not to represent the best interests of their district. Sure, we organize ourselves as Republicans and Democrats, but sometimes I don't have anything in common with some of the Democrats from Madison and Milwaukee because I have a district to represent and I've got to take into account, the interests long-term and short-term. One of the things I was going to say is, in terms of independence, we're also supposed to be a check and balance. We have an executive branch, a legislative branch, and judicial branch, and this was so we would be very deliberate, and so we would be able to check each other. And time after time, the legislature appeared to be more of a rubber stamp, approving things. Nothing. The example that comes to mind is on the mining bill. When the Journal Sentinel did an open records request, they found out that the mining company actually drafted the language of the bill. And when we asked which member authored the bill, who's responsible, not a single legislative member, not a single elected official took responsibility for writing the bill. So we had a company who wants to do business in the state writing a bill, looking out for their interests, but with questions unanswered. And when we looked at the bill, and got a letter from FEMA saying this bill eliminates federal flood insurance for the entire state of Wisconsin, I started getting calls from people in Oshkosh saying, what? And when we told them that, they still didn't change it. The Senate ended up changing that part of it, but it's an example of when people are too willing to go along with special interest groups, maybe go along with an executive who's getting a little, big in the head on pushing an agenda. But they're certainly not doing, service to the public, and time after time that seemed to be the case.
Anybody who cares about the environment of this state could not vote for that bill. As you say, it was 186 pages written by an out-of-state mining company with the ability to come in and plunder our natural resources, affecting multiple thousands of miles of Class A trout streams, and some of them that run into Lake Superior. Something like 22,000 acres were already under some sort of a lease.
They pushed for as much as they could because they thought they could get it.
And it was challenged by anybody who had any interest in the environment, by the Indian people who had had this land over thousands and thousands of years. It was set to go through instantly without any public input. There were no checks and balances, no abilities to have hearings about the environmental impact. It was really a well-greased snow job, and I have no respect for anybody who would vote for that bill.
And I mean, it was crazy the kind of questions that would come up at the hearings when people would ask, well, what happens when they come across burial remains of, Native Americans, or, what happens to the tailings that are produced in the mining process that go into the air or that go into the water? Is it treated? Where does the water go? I mean, these are just, basic questions. These are questions you would ask if you were going to dig a hole in your backyard. But this has the potential to impact a big part of the state. I think mining has modernized. I think we've seen this type of mining in Michigan and Minnesota, but our law was nowhere near what they had. And I think that, no one met with me. No one tried to meet with me. There was no effort to try to garner any compromise or, any environmental considerations. They went for the whole enchilada because they thought, look at these guys. They're a rubber stamp. We can blow anything by them. Time after time again, this seems to be the new way of doing things in Wisconsin.
And the people who were against it were the scientists, people like George Meyer, formerly the head of the DNR, the conservationists, the historians, people who cared about the tradition of northern Wisconsin. And I don't think any of these people are anti-mining.
No.
They simply want intelligent mining that doesn't destroy the part of the state for thousands of years.
Then there's you don't get to do things like this over. If you're going to change an entire state law for one company to impact a surface area larger than Lake Winnebago, you better get it right. I don't think the company would intentionally try to do things, and I certainly want the jobs, but there has to be a balance and there has to be a process that makes sure that we're being serious about our diligence on this, and that we're at least getting everybody to say, well, this is a good compromise.
But that approach wasn't much different than the rest of the legislative session. I mean, when you think about how they rammed through the voter ID law, when there's no evidence ever been developed that we have a fraud problem, but it just happens to impact the poor, the students, the transient, the elderly, and the people who don't drive, people more likely to vote Democrat than Republican. And of course, now its constitutionality has been challenged. What they did in Act 10 was clearly to reward the unions that had supported Governor Walker and punish those that had supported his opponent and encourage people to not be in the union, and that's been struck down by both courts on constitutional grounds. What they have done with the wetlands of just have a quick method of going around all of the rules, and so now without notice, without hearings, if it's a small wetland, the DNR, which has now become an organ of the Republican Party, can pass it, and oh yeah, you can make it all right by mitigation, which means for every acre that's taken, you can go to any other part of the state and buy some cheap land, dig a ditch, and hose some water in it and call it a new wetland to replace the one that was 10,000 years in the building. Those are just some of the examples. What they've done to the civil justice system deserves a whole different program. But again, it's punishment, just one example, besides ruining the value of your insurance policy without you getting a dime reduction, a big gift to the insurance corporations. It's pretty clear that the Republicans have operated as the corporate party as opposed to the People's Party. And we've got a break, and we're going to come back, and I'm going to shut up a little to give you some opportunity to shoot me down, if you will, Gordon. I do appreciate you being on the show.
Absolutely.
And we'll be right back. I'm George Curtis. Welcome back to It's Your Law. Gordon Hintz and I are talking about recent legislative session and some of the wild things, at least I think, that have happened, and some of the issues that are awfully important. We saw union busting going on. We saw tort issues that took away a lot of consumer rights and gave them to insurance companies. We saw some real body blows on the environment. Those are things important to everybody in Wisconsin. But I would guess equally important, even though we spend more money on prisons than we do on education, I think education is more important. And there's some things going on in that field, aren't there?
Yeah, I think this is, after a while it seemed, when you had so many issues, like it seemed like maybe they were just throwing so much at the wall that the papers got tired of covering everything. But, we saw a substantial shift in the priorities of our education system in Wisconsin. We had the largest cuts in state history to our K-12 education system. At a time when we were already seeing record retirements, we were seeing morale at its lowest. We saw an entire vocation stepped on that's going to damage us for years to come. But we saw an increase in the public taxpayer-funded dollars that are going for private school vouchers, the same schools that aren't held to any accountability standards that the public and charter schools are. And in all my time running for office, we've had big debates about class size, about, 4-year-old kindergarten, on ways to improve, teacher performance and address, some of the social issues in our school. I've never heard anybody say, boy, what's really going to solve the school problems if we take taxpayer dollars out of public schools and give them to private schools who can self-select which students they take and really, further erode the quality. Not just in Milwaukee, but the governor said he wants to have taxpayer-funded vouchers for private schools statewide in Green Bay and Racine and other cities. And we had a bill last year that if we hadn't made a fix at the end of session, Menasha and Green Bay would have had the option for taxpayer-funded private vouchers beginning next year. And to me, it's crazy. Things like the environment, things like our public education system are things that Republicans and Democrats built in this state over time. They're things that the families that we represent have always valued. They were sort of always, we believed in these things, and we believed they were worth investing in and worth protecting. And, we talked about the environment a second ago, but we know the economy is stressing our system out, and we know that we need to improve and innovate and change with with the times and the new challenges. But dismantling it like this, when everything else is being cut to shift dollars and priorities to what has really been another ideological movement in Wisconsin. I mean, the biggest funders of campaigns, even bigger than WMC now, is the school choice movement. The Walton family, who owns Walmart, the Amway family, the DeVoses, they're all spending millions of dollars in Wisconsin on campaigns. And usually their ads say nothing about vouchers, but sure enough, we're hearing more and more that part of the agenda is to, take taxpayer dollars and move them into private schools, again, where we don't have any accountability, where the test scores are below public scores. And what it does is, leaves a higher concentration of some of the more difficult students in public schools and, have self-selection for the other students. And, when I tell people this, they're pretty outraged on it. The surveys that I did out to my district, asking people about it, reflected that.
And I think you respect the fact that you don't just represent those people who voted for you.
No.
Once you're elected, you represent the people who voted for the other guy. Mm-hmm. And I think that until we get back to that kind of a process in the legislature, we're just going to have more of this excess partisan destructive government that, frankly, we have in Washington. That's frozen too. It's getting absolutely nowhere.
And we do. I mean, it's rigid, sort of ideological purity, and we need to get back to when the two-party system works, it can work pretty well. I mean, here's the problem. Here's what we're trying to address, and here are multiple solutions come from different ideologies that can try to do that. But what we're seeing now is sort of sticking in interest group legislation that benefits one side or hurts another, and seems to be aimed at not the world that we actually live in. A lot of these ideas, I give my opponent, colleagues credit, but I want everybody to be personally responsible, and I want everybody to get out of poverty and have a good paying job. But the reality is we have to deal with the world we live in, where we have homeless kids in our schools that have tremendous challenges, that we have a lot of students with free or reduced school lunch, that we have a large prison population, that we have a struggling economy. We can't make assumptions and pass policies based on a world that we want to live in. And I think we really need to get back to that, and people should expect more from their legislature.
And we've spent 100 years cleaning up our rivers and lakes from when industry was allowed to treat it as a sewer. Mm-hmm. And we still have health problems for our unborn babies and for pregnant mothers because it's going to take another 100 years to get the poisons out. But I have noticed from the environmental standpoint that actually everything that this administration has done has weakened the environmental protections in favor of corporate interest. That troubles me. Everything that I've seen done in terms of our education has weakened the educational system, and this voucher thing is really scary. Mm-hmm. I think that what we need is people that are going to realize that they're not just Republicans and not just Democrats and not Tea Parties and not stuck with the idea that our party has now become the party of whatever it is. In the Republican sense, it seems to be that it's wars, prisons, and corporate immunity. But they try to put the label on the Democrats as the party to throw away money. Mm-hmm. And we've got to make sure that if that's true, that gets fixed. We need people that go there and really represent what's important in this state. I'm sure you agree, and I'm sure you're out there campaigning, and you will be until the 6th.
Absolutely. I mean, that's what elections are about. You get a chance to talk about your message, but also listen to what's out there and try to remind people not to be cynical. I mean, we all need to hang in there. I think, until we get some kind of campaign finance reform and you have all this big money being spent, you're going to see interests that don't seem to be the ones that are all important to all of us, the ones that are enacted in the legislature, because I saw it when I was in the majority, and now that I'm in the minority, there are people out there that, legislative system is complicated, and people and groups that have interests are going to take advantage of it at every time.
And Wisconsin can't afford another 2 years like the last two.
I'm hopeful that you know, I'm going to give it another shot here, and you know, that's part of the reason. I think we need to have some checks and balances in there, and you know, we need to hold you know, the legislature and the governor accountable going forward. And you know, I want to be a part of trying to restore, you know, the legislature in the state of Wisconsin to what I think it can be.
Amen. Thanks and good luck.
Thanks for having me.
Nationally and in the state of Wisconsin, we are going through a difficult, partisan, mean, hateful period of time. I think we have to go back and revisit our values. What is really important? One of the things that concerns me greatly is the corporate religion that seems to be taking over. Corporations can spend millions of dollars secretly, without even identifying who is paying the money, to buy elections for the Supreme Court of the state of Wisconsin. For other offices, the corporations are buying our government, and the corporations are being rewarded by politicians whose coffers are filled during election time by giving them breaks. And when we look at the legislation that has been passed in the state of Wisconsin over the past 2 years, it's all for the benefit of corporations, to the injury of our educational system, our environment, our children, and our future. I think we all have to revisit, is this a government by and for the people or for the money? I think it's the former. I'm George Curtis.